Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's installment of Creation Justice webinars. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Minister for Environmental Justice at the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by Birmingham, Alabama's Trumpet of Justice, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who serves as the Executive Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. Michael, with our focus on false solutions to the climate crisis today, I'm thinking biblically about sheep being led astray. One of the frustrating parts of working on climate issues is the circulation of bad ideas. I'm not sure how else to put it. So don't get me wrong, not everyone needs to be in agreement on everything, and it's good to have a diversity of ideas. But at the same time, we don't need to be sheep wandering in the wrong direction when we have a race to run. What are your thoughts today as we frame our conversation? Tell us your thoughts before I jump into introducing our three panelists for today.
Well, you know what, Brooks, I had an opportunity to be in DC a couple of weeks ago, and I went to the National Mall, to the monuments, and I went by FDR's monument and reflecting on the Green New Deal and that which was trying to be solved by the Green New Deal. We also understand, I mean, not the Green New Deal, but the New Deal, excuse me. We also understand that with the New Deal, there were swaths of people or populations that were left out of that particular plan. And now we have other solutions that are now coming about that we also have to monitor and ensure that there are those who are out on the outer margins of society who aren't being left out of that plan. Those of us who are Black and brown and Indigenous, those of us who are in rural communities, and those of us who are of lower economic wealth aren't being left out and aren't being used as guinea pigs. And I think that that's why we're having this conversation. That's why we have these leaders on this call, because we want to discuss what it's like to be at policy tables and have these particular policies come about and come to play, and ensuring that we as people of faith who are to be watchers on the wall, we as people of faith who are those who are shepherds of our particular flocks, or those who are leaders in our congregations, those who are people of faith who believe in people having a healthy and thriving life, having water, fresh, clean water, having fresh, clean air, having a livable wage job that doesn't harm the planet and doesn't harm people. Being able to have these things and discussing these particular policies and ensuring as people of faith that we hold our, not just our decision makers, but those who influence our decision makers as well, accountable, and ensuring that we are also a part of that party who is influential of our decision makers. And the best way to do that is to get an education. I believe that we have to have some learning before it comes to go along, with the burning that we have. And so I think that we have some excellent guests today. I know a couple of these guests personally, and I can even say that they're colleagues in this work with me. And so I'm interested and longing to have this conversation publicly. And I am glad that we were able to be the first platform. And I want to say that again, Brooks. I need everybody to hear that. Let us brag on ourselves for a minute. We are the first public platform, and in particular, a platform of faith that is offering different views on a clean energy standard. We've got the clean energy standard, we've got the renewable energy standard, and we've got also our Indigenous leadership all on the same call for the first time. And I think that that needs to be noted, and it needs to even be shared for our larger audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Michael Malcolm. I think people would pay to have your endorsement. So thank you for that. We have a terrific lineup today. I want to say that at the last minute, we had to make some adjustments. Leah Stokes was going to join us, but she had an unforeseen matter arise and couldn't make it. But she put forward a very capable policy analyst in Arjun Krishnaswamy. Let me introduce our speakers now in the order in which they'll be speaking. First up, we'll have Gabriela Sari Tobar, who is the energy justice campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity. She works to advance a just and equitable transition to 100% clean, democratic, and distributed energy across the country. Previously, she worked with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network on a campaign that successfully passed clean energy legislation in Maryland. She has additionally worked with our Children's Trust on the Juliana versus the United States case by mobilizing members of Congress to support children's fundamental rights and a climate recovery plan. We'll then have Arjun Krishnaswamy, who is a climate policy lead with the Natural Resources Defense Council's Climate and Clean Energy Program. In this role, he develops and advocates for just and equitable energy policies to combat the climate crisis, focusing on federal investments and standards. He additionally specializes in energy innovation and improved technology solutions to address climate change. He holds a bachelor's degree in environmental systems engineering and a master's in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University. And then bringing us home today, we will have Ashley McCray Ingle. She is Ogala Sichangu Lakota and absentee Shawnee. She works on the Green New Deal campaign with the Indigenous Environmental Network, fighting for federal inclusion of free, prior, and informed consent, strong tribal sovereignty standards, and against false solutions in Green New Deal policies. In 2018, Ashley was the Oklahoma Democratic nominee for the statewide office of the Corporation Commission, which is the regulatory agency responsible for overseeing oil, gas, utility, and transportation. Prior to this, Ashley organized with Stop the Plains All-American Pipeline. In 2017, I like the title of this one, Vice TV filmed Ashley's work in an Oklahoma-based episode of Hate Thy Neighbor called United States of Oil and Gas. In 2015, Ashley was awarded the White House's Champion of Courage Award for Young Women Empowering Communities and the Sierra Club's Red Earth Group's Activist of the Year Award. Thank you for all of our panelists joining us today, and we will get started with you, Gabriela.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone today. So I guess I kind of just wanted to start off by framing where we're at right now, given this historic infrastructure package that Congress is working on, and this massive opportunity we have to pass real climate solutions and take bold steps to tackle the climate emergency and advance a just energy future for all communities. And I think this brings up really important questions about how we go about doing that and what are the actual policies that will get us there. So President Biden's made commitments to transform our energy sector so that it's zero emissions by 2035 and pledged to cut US carbon emissions by 50% of 2005 levels by 2030. And with these goals in mind, he set out specific recommendations for where investment should go, one of which is around a clean energy standard. And I want to acknowledge how massive of a step this is that we have the president and Congress talking about a clean energy standard, or really any federal energy standard. And I think this speaks to the work of organizations and communities across the country who are pushing on leadership to take bold climate action. That said, we do have concerns around a CES and disagree that it's the best path forward to tackling the climate emergency. We're seeing the consequences of the climate emergency right now and really cannot afford to take half measures. So, we're at this pivotal point where we're facing the triple crises of racism, climate, and ecocide. And we really only have a short amount of time to take bold action. We have to ensure that we're rebuilding our energy system so that we can tackle all of these issues and stop perpetuating all of the injustices of our current energy system, which is why we have been pushing for a renewable energy standard that would achieve 100% renewable energy and a just transition with massive investment in distributed renewable energy resources and prioritizing investment in environmental justice in frontline communities. So just to kind of give a little brief about what the state of play is right now in Congress, we have Majority Leader Schumer's American Jobs Plan that has kind of split into two plans, one being a bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the second a reconciliation bill. The reconciliation bill is where we're actually seeing all the climate and energy investment. And based on information we've received from Senate, which is unfortunately a tad limited, we know that one of the top lines in the reconciliation bill is for a clean energy standard. Just a couple weeks ago, Majority Leader Schumer announced that there would be no gas in an upcoming clean energy standard. However, just a few days later, Senator Tina Smith, who has the leading clean energy standard legislation on the Senate, said that gas and carbon capture and storage would be included in a clean energy standard. So that's raised a lot of concerns for us and for environmental justice communities across the country, because if we're really going to be moving to take bold action and address the climate emergency and transition to a just energy future, we need to make sure we're not perpetuating the injustices of our current energy system, that we are not investing in false solutions that we know disproportionately harm environmental justice communities. So, you know, I'm going to just dive into a little bit more about what some of our concerns are around a clean energy standard, and want to start by looking at what the House proposal is, which is the Clean Future Act. And I think this is a perfect example of the many red flags with the clean energy standard. So some analysis that we've conducted shows that 99% of uncaptured gas under the Clean Future Act would receive partial credits for at least the next decade, without even addressing other false solutions like carbon capture and storage, biomass and biogas, and nuclear. And the Smith bill is really no better, as it also would accommodate for technologies like carbon capture and storage, continuing to subsidize gas companies and the fossil fuel industry. So, you know, we really need to tackle these false solutions and move past them. Again, just reiterating that we need to be taking bold steps and not settling for half measures. So, you know, time is ticking, and we shouldn't be investing in energy sources that will further embed the fossil fuel industry and injustice for years to come. And we really can't afford any more Band-Aid fixes, passing policy that would continue to lift up the fossil fuel industry while compromising the health and homes and futures of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-wealth communities. So that's really why we've been pushing for a renewable energy standard that invests in technologies that actually advance a just energy future and benefit environmental justice in frontline communities. And more than 700 organizations have come out and set forth a positive vision for a 100% renewable energy standard that excludes gas and false solutions, and which truly centers justice so as to advance a just energy future for all communities. So critically, an RES clearly defines which energy sources do and do not qualify to ensure that we're investing in real climate solutions like solar, wind, and geothermal. And 100% renewable energy by 2030 is possible. It's supported by leading scientists, and it's consistent with climate science and global equity. We're also calling for an at least 25% carve out for distributed renewable energy resources and storage, like rooftop and community solar, that brings substantial benefits to communities, including grid resilience, making electricity more affordable and accessible, energy democracy, and even local economic recovery. It would also exclude gas and false solutions, while including strong regulations and programs that would advance environmental, social, racial, and ecological justice. And another critical piece is that it would guarantee 50% of investments in environmental justice communities and support for impacted worker communities so that we can ensure a just transition. So to end, I just want to reiterate that we really need to be building towards energy democracy, 100% renewables, decentralized energy structures, and public power. A 100% renewable energy standard that has an at least 25% carve out for DER and storage is the way we get there. Again, it provides so many benefits to communities that have often been left behind as we continue to rely on fossil fuels and a centralized energy system. And we need to make sure that we're making direct investments in communities who are hardest hit and who are on the front lines of the climate emergency. So we have this once in a lifetime opportunity to build back justly and really nip racism, climate, and ecocide in one go. We believe the renewable energy standard is the way to do that. And we can't settle for half measures like a clean energy standard that would include gas and false solutions. So thanks.
Thank you, Gabriella. And we'll now hear from Arjun.
Thank you, Reverend Burt and Reverend Malcolm for inviting us to participate, and thanks, Gabriella and Ashley. I'm excited for this discussion. So I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing on the legislative fight that is unfolding this summer, and what we're trying to sort of the principles that are guiding our participation, and what we're trying to achieve, what we think is at stake, and a little bit of the specifics of what we think the outcomes might be if we win the things that we're fighting for. And I'm going to show some slides, see if this works. All right. So can you see these slides? Give me a thumbs up. There we go. Thank you, Reverend Burt. So first off, just to start on what we're trying to achieve here, we think, as Gabriella mentioned, thanks to the work of organizers over the last many years and the incredible work pressuring President Biden and candidate Biden before that, we came into this administration with a commitment from the president and from Congress to shoot for 100% clean electricity by 2035, and that goal was the centerpiece of the president's climate plan, and then the American Jobs Plan after that, and now is a key commitment that we think we can and should continue to hold Congress and the president accountable on as we have this legislative opportunity this summer. And so we see this as, we need to take advantage of our real chance right now. It's a fleeting chance, perhaps, to radically remake our electricity system and to eliminate pollution as quickly as possible. And as part of that, to make major immediate reductions in power sector pollution starting right away, while we also expand the electricity system to address pollution that's coming from our homes and our buildings and our vehicles and industrial facilities. We also see a chance in this legislative package, a real chance to stop the build out of the 230 plus planned new gas plants and gas infrastructure that is in the pipeline if we don't win some sort of standard, definitely in a business as usual world, but perhaps even even with some of the other investments that are on the table alone. We also think there's a chance this year through legislation to win policy that would shut down the coal fleet and eliminate pollution from those coal facilities that harms communities, while also dramatically cutting into the use of gas in power plants that is also contributing heavily to poor air quality and public health harms. In parallel, we think there's a chance here to drive unprecedented renewable energy growth with good jobs and pollution reductions, and to make sure that happens everywhere across the country, especially in places that would see less initial progress in some of the standards that have been put forth in previous Congresses with sort of national credit trading markets. And we also think we're in this moment where we have an unprecedented political will to invest federal money in addressing our nation's crises. And that means we have a chance to push for federal investment that protects people, households and businesses from high energy burden, that addresses the energy burden crises that we're facing, and to do that while we're transforming the electricity system. So with those goals in mind, why do we think 100% clean electricity is important for our climate goals? Well, a clean electricity system plus electrification, replacing fossil fuels with electricity and our other in transportation and industry and buildings together could eliminate 75% of climate warming pollution from our energy system. And that in and of itself, that is half of the power sector reductions in and of themselves are half of President Biden's commitment to achieving 50 to 52% reduction from economy-wide by 2030, which we want to hold the administration accountable to. And it's not just, those are carbon pollution numbers. It's not just carbon pollution. It's the reductions in sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides and particulate matter that come with replacing fossil fuels from both the electricity system and the other sectors. So what are we pushing for in that we think are essential in this package to hold Congress and the administration accountable to meeting that target? A clean electricity standard, which obviously is the focus of the discussion today, but also grants focused on community and distributed solar, clean energy challenge grants that we think can also get at building out a distributed system. And if we design them right and pressure the administration, can also support the energy democracy goals, building wealth in communities that are at risk of being left behind by the clean energy transition, funding to cut pollution and environmental justice in overburdened communities, to target facilities that are polluting communities, Black and brown and low-income communities with a much higher share of pollution. The clean energy tax credits, which cut the cost of renewable energy generators, funding for rural electric co-ops whose customers face disproportionately high energy costs, worker transition and wage replacement, and transmission investments. And we and the groups we're working with, our mantra has been that we need to pressure Congress to hold space for all of these pieces that are all critical to solve not just climate emissions, but all the other challenges associated with making this radical transformation of our electricity grid over the next 10 years, making it possible and doing it in a way that benefits people and protects people from further inequities. For the clean electricity standard in particular, the way that we are coming at our advocacy and engagement in the clean electricity standard is to push on the fights that we think are on the table within the bounds of where the conversation is, and to really push on the things that we think we can accomplish. That means creating a simple program that fits within this somewhat arcane budget reconciliation process, but to fit within that program to achieve 80% clean energy by 2030 alongside large pollution reductions, to do so in a way that supports electricity customers, makes the transition affordable, and avoids increased energy burden, and to ensure that the investment is happening everywhere, that there's clean energy investment, that some communities don't get left behind by because the clean energy investment is happening elsewhere. and to drive major greenhouse gas and other air pollution reductions for public health and climate benefit. I think the critical question that Gabrielle also started to dive into is what is the definition of clean? We have renewable energy standards that are on the table. We have various clean electricity standards that have different approaches to defining clean. And we think that an electricity standard that can pass this Congress, our sort of assumption going into this is that it's likely to include an emissions intensity definition of clean. And so we have, our engagement here is to evaluate, well, what does that mean in terms of outcomes of a CES, and what are the risks associated with that? As we know, a range of energy technologies may be eligible, a different range depending on where that emissions intensity is. We think it's really important that emissions intensity it does not include uncontrolled gas, and think that that's a fight that we'll have to continue to wage. There's some promising commitments there from Senator Schumer, as Gabriela mentioned, but still think that's a big risk, that we want to ensure that emissions intensity is low enough to exclude uncontrolled gas. Where we are coming at an emissions intensity that includes other low emission or zero emission technologies that we don't want to see built, like CCS and nuclear, is that even if those technologies are included, they are unproven, they're extremely expensive, and they're uncompetitive with the solutions that we know work, like wind and solar and energy storage. And we don't think that they can compete with renewables, especially on the timeline we're talking about of a massive change in the next 10 years. Which is why we think that a CES would drive renewable energy and energy efficiency growth to meet the targets and the pace that we're talking about. And the analysis that we've worked on and that some other groups have looked at supports this. Even if you allow CCS and new nuclear to qualify for a CES as has been proposed, what gets built is just massive, unprecedented amounts of wind and solar and storage, and that's the outcome we want to see. We want to make sure that happens, and that's how we rebuild and expand our electricity system. One I think critical fight in the definition of clean and what qualifies is going to be within an emissions intensity approach is what happens to biomass, and there's different outcomes that could happen here. The biomass, if you just looked at the emissions that come out of the facility, as many of you know, I think it's highly polluting, both from a climate perspective and from a health perspective, local pollution perspective. And the only way that biomass could qualify for a carbon emissions intensity standard is based on a version of life cycle accounting that shows the emissions coming in low or carbon neutral. And so the fight around biomass is to make sure that it does not qualify. What we want to do is not allow biomass to qualify for a standard. And if that happens, then a CES or a standard that excludes biomass could actually help reduce these facilities that have already been built and that are polluting communities. And we can talk more about this, but the way that if there are questions on this, but the way that we think that is likely to happen, where we could win on that really critical fight, is by winning with the administration on a definition, on a life cycle accounting mechanism, pushing for a really rigorous science-based life cycle emissions accounting that doesn't allow biomass to qualify for a standard, and ensuring that it's excluded and actually decreases as a result. I think I'm approaching my 10 minutes, so I'll just say a few more words, which is I think what we're looking for here, not just the climate benefits, not just these other programs that I mentioned, but also ensuring that the package achieves massive pollution reductions to improve public health. And we think there's a really big opportunity here. The pollution from fossil fuel combustion is enormous. Fine particulate matter, which a big portion of which comes from power plants, is responsible for 85,000 to 200,000 deaths per year in the US. and even sort of models of less ambitious clean electricity standards that are not what we want to support show that you could really cut into the public health impacts of fossil fuel combustion, ranging on the order of 93% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions and 76% reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions. Finally, I think I want to leave on this note is that the way that we're thinking about this is what happens if we fail here, if we don't pass a standard that goes beyond what's already sort of what is already supposed to be included in the package, some investments and through the tax code and grant programs and some money to EPA. That means that we likely fail to hit this 80% by 2030 on the way to 100% target. It means that the administration does not have a leg to stand on for their NDC 50% commitment by 2030. And it means that we don't really have a tool in our toolbox to address the 230 gas plants that are in the queue right now. So, the fight will go on, but we think there's a critical chance here that may not come for a while to really put us on track to transform the electricity system in the next 10 years. And look forward to the conversation, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Arjun. And we'll now turn things over to Ashley.
Thank you very much. Halako ke, Ho'isiye no lako relatives. I'm so happy to be here today. I also have a presentation to share with you and hope that these tools and resources that I provide will be useful for you in your education toward what fossil fuels are. Arjun and Gabby really laid out what a clean energy standard and a renewable energy standard looks like. And as Indigenous peoples on the front lines of the climate crisis, we're really being impacted by a lot of these decisions that policymakers are making that, often are done without our consent or without our participation. And today, I really want to provide some more color to the dialogue and really explain why Indigenous people, at least, are really aligned with the position that Gabby laid out and why we signed on to that letter for a renewable energy standard. We really believe that neoliberal policies and solutions like those that are laid out in the clean energy standard are just a way of kicking the problem down the road for future generations to deal with. And as Indigenous people, we have to always think of our future generations as well as what it means to be an ancestor, a future ancestor ourselves. And so, as Gabby mentioned earlier, we are in this moment of overlapping crises. Our ocean's on fire, our land is on fire, our entire system is on fire. And, we're really seeing, the impacts of the climate crisis, not just for communities like mine who are living in Oklahoma, which is home to pipeline crossroads of the world. And we have more earthquakes than California because of fracking. But also, even on the Washington Post, I think just the other day I saw that, wealthy nations are finally feeling the impact of climate crisis too. And so, I really want to approach this through a climate justice framework and really explain, Indigenous principles of just transition and why, we're involved in this fight, why fighting against false solutions is really crucial to the fight that we do in the policy world. And so, a climate justice framework, it does not reduce the climate crisis to a puzzle simply focused on counting carbon. Grassroots, community-led movements around the world look across the economy to really seek and lift up real solutions around us every day, whether that be Indigenous traditional knowledge, food sovereignty, decommodification of land, healthcare and housing, abolishing the military-industrial complex, and really lifting up just transition and energy democracy. These are really intersecting things, and we have to really address these through an intersecting lens. And so I really want to share these Indigenous principles of just transition in a really story format, because that's the way that my ancestors communicate, and the way that I really think that can provide best color and understanding to this debate. And so first, I'm going to start out by lifting up what real solutions are. And so, first and foremost, they must be guided by principled practice. They must also be guided by indigenous traditional knowledge and public interest science. They must be holistic in tackling intertwined ecological and social harm. They must replace economies of greed with economies that serve ecological and human need. They must advance deep, direct, and participatory democracy that is rooted in local self-determination. And finally, it must center the leadership and needs of those who are presently and historically most harmed. And this is really important. And I really wanted to start out with these real solutions so that you can see why these Indigenous principles of just transition really fit into this conversation and debate around false solutions. And so starting off with natural law and Indigenous lifeways. Recognizing natural law is really the first step toward a regenerative anti-colonial future in which reciprocity, harmony, balance, responsibility, and respect for each other and all life is restored. By doing the work of subjugating ourselves to natural law, we are denouncing and dismantling the false colonial hierarchies that put humans above nature and lead to the destruction and oppression that we are all living with today, not just Indigenous peoples. And as far as Indigenous lifeways are concerned, it really isn't that Indigenous peoples are better or more special than our other relatives. It's just that our specific and unique relationship to settler colonialism and the specific land that we're on, because again, that's really important to look at this in a global context and recognize that there are Indigenous people all over the globe. And recognizing that our unique relationship to this land means that we have the roadmap to move us collectively outside of the colonial systems that continue to harm us all. And prior to colonization, Indigenous peoples of this land lived sustainably alongside our non-human relatives and each other since time immemorial. Our relatives who came to this land through settler colonial projects, do have a lot to learn from the ways that Indigenous peoples live and the deep ancestral knowledge we carry, whether that be in the United States, in Canada, so-called Mexico, or Central America, or elsewhere. And Indigenous and tribal sovereignty, this leads us into our next principles. So to recognize Indigenous and tribal sovereignty is to really recognize the inherent autonomy, self-determination, and agency of Indigenous peoples worldwide. Indigenous peoples existed within their own nations' unique social, cultural, and political structures, again, since time immemorial, well before the inception of the settler colonial system that we live under now. And more so, sovereignty is a legally binding concept recognized and put forth by this occupying force, meaning that Indigenous peoples of this land do have a unique relationship to the so-called United States. And in order to move forward toward a regenerative future, which is what we're all fighting for, and I believe everyone on this panel is really trying to achieve, it is vital that we join together to ensure that Indigenous and tribal sovereignty is not just recognized, but realized, because Indigenous and tribal sovereignty is good for everyone, because it really provides this added layer of protection from the harmful impacts of capitalism and colonization that we see really attacking the land. And then this moves us into another principle, which is rights of nature. And it's actually becoming a legal principle as well. It's been passed in New Zealand. The Ponca Nation here in the state of Oklahoma has actually passed it through their tribal council. And Casey Kaporanek, who is a Ponca elder and activist, has really been pushing forward this campaign all throughout the globe. And for us, how we define rights of nature, before colonization, Indigenous peoples of this land lived in right relationship with each other and our non-human relatives. We understood the spiritual force that exists in all life forms and connects us all. With the marriage of colonization and capitalism, we have truly witnessed the utter destruction of life as we know it. Our non-human relatives being relegated, commodified, and exploited as resources, when the truth is we are all bound together in this life journey. And today we must reframe our conversations in such a way that even the capitalistic or colonizing person can understand. This is why we must not only recognize, acknowledge, and respect the inherent rights of nature, we must also push to ensure that our rivers, our mountains, and the lands are also legally protected from those who would seek to cause much harm. And then this brings me into the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which is really a federal policy effort that we are pushing forward alongside many other national Native organizations to really, make sure that we're able to retain this, right relationship with each other and with the earth, and to, move into this good relationship with each other as well. And so free, prior, informed consent, it really is a basic underpinning of Indigenous peoples' inherent right of self-determination. It includes the provision of timely, adequate, and accessible information prior to any planning or implementation of a proposed action or project. Indigenous peoples' right to consent, and importantly to not consent, must be based upon the Indigenous peoples' own decision-making processes, customary laws and practices, free of coercion or manipulation. This includes participation and consent in setting the terms and conditions of any proposal addressing the economic, societal, cultural, spiritual, and environmental impacts of the Indigenous peoples who are concerned, and if appropriate, any climate impacts. FPIC, or free, prior, informed consent, is an international concept. It just so happens that the United States is really far behind. And what this looks like on the ground, by the United States codifying free, prior, informed consent, we can help ensure that a culture of consent with Indigenous peoples and our nations becomes normalized right here and right now. In real life on the ground, this looks like no more illegal pipelines like Dakota Access and Enbridge Line 3, a decrease in the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, children, and relatives that impacts each and every one of us in our respective communities. And this horrible reality is only accelerated by the occurrence of man camps that are located near fossil fuel and other extractive projects, whether it be, carbon capture, storage, or, a pipeline. The same thing is going to happen to our communities. And finally, it looks like the recognition and realization of Indigenous and tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and autonomy, all of which are inherent rights written in treaties that were made with the United States. And so now I can move into what false solutions are. And this is really, one of our principles as well in false solutions. And you can really see, I hope, with the story that I'm telling, how it fits within the context of Indigenous principles of just transition. And here I have listed some of the false solutions that we've identified, but of course there are others, and don't worry, hold tight, the next slide has actual resources. So with false solutions, for over 20 years, the fossil fuel industries, development banks, and conservation organizations have been at the forefront of developing carbon pricing systems that are designed to continue fossil fuel extraction. Carbon pricing systems in all of their iterations, whether that be cap and trade, carbon taxes, RED, net zero emissions, nature-based solutions, offsets, carbon capture and storage, and so on, distract attention away from keeping fossil fuels in the ground. They divide communities and divert funding away from a true just transition. Carbon pricing systems do not stop or reduce climate change. The fast carbon cycle of the biosphere does not act as an endless sponge to store carbon from the combustion of slow cycle fossil fuels that were already safely stored underground. If the trees and soils could endlessly absorb fossil carbon, we would not have climate change at all. For Indigenous peoples the world over, these programs threaten Indigenous sovereignty and land rights, reduce Mother Nature to a commodity to be bought and sold in a financialized market, and target communities of color. Ultimately, the program benefit the white male capitalist power brokers, carbon majors, and industries. The carbon traders on Turtle Island, which is also known as the United States, cunningly study tribal government so they can implement projects without full tribal consent, causing much division and discord in our tribal nations. Frequently, tribal members do not even know there's a project underway, what a carbon offset is, or how it benefits the carbon traders. Because carbon pricing systems serve to greenwash the fossil fuel industry, or to make it look like it's doing the work of fighting the climate crisis, IEN rejects carbon pricing in all of its forms. And we demand that carbon project managers, brokers, traders, tree measurers, big conservation organizations, development banks, and their government allies stop targeting and dividing Indigenous peoples and our tribal governments. If we are serious about stopping climate change, then solidarity in resisting carbon pricing systems must start now. And this is really what we see as an Indigenous sovereignty, land back and keep it in the ground issue. And finally, here is a site for all of the different resources that I've been drawing off of today that I really hope that you take the time to check out further. This top link, climatefallsolutions.org, is really helpful. We just we partnered with many other organizations and academics to publish the 3rd edition of Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which really does talk about all of these fall solutions and lays them out in depth. Skyprotector.org, that's an IEN website that also links the fight to fighting false solutions to a global perspective. And you know, just one last thing that I'll say is that, you know, as Indigenous peoples who are on the front line of the climate crisis, and because, you know, we have to really look at this from a global perspective, you know, we're really hoping that people will check out these resources and really consider that our relatives who are in the global south are really impacted by the decisions that we make here today, whether that be, you know, climate policies that, you know, run along a neoliberal agenda and just kick the can of problems down the road for other generations to deal with, or, you know, advancing false solutions. You know, we have to realize that we are global citizens and that we have much privilege living in the so-called United States. And so I just want to say Niyawe and Wopila for having me on the panel today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ashley, Arjun, as well as Gabriella. You all rock my world, I tell you. Thank you for the information. While we're talking, and I think I'm gonna get to one of the questions while asking this particular question. So we're talking about these false solutions versus solutions that we know work. We know that solar, we know that wind works. We know that it's safer. We can't say that it's totally safe, because none of it is totally safe. All of it has its elements of destruction in them. And let's just be honest about that. But there are some things that we know simply either doesn't work or are so far along that we don't know if we know that it won't be enough to come back in the time frame that we need it. Things such as carbon sequestration, and things that we know work are solar and wind. Why is it that we aren't investing more into the things that we know that actually works versus the things that we know that we don't know work? Again, carbon sequestration, we don't know if it will work. Carbon markets, we know aren't working and are unjust. So what do we do? And why don't we advocate more for the things that we know works versus the things that we know are questionable? And I'll put that to anybody that desires to answer.
I can go first, I guess. I think we have this giant enemy, which is the fossil fuel companies, who pump a lot of money and lobbying and basically working with members of Congress to push their own agenda. So I think they're, of course, in their fossil fuel corporations are the big enemy here. And I think what we have on our side, of course, is people power. And all of us coming together to really demand that they listen to us and that we're pushing for renewable energy solutions. I think that's the biggest thing we can do right now.
And I'll build on that. I mean, I think there's, I won't speak to the sort of politics of why there's so much pressure to invest in these technologies that we don't think will work, but just I think in terms of what we are trying to achieve, what the chance we have here is to make a massive investment in wind and solar, right? I think our goal is to pass policies that will enable us to build out wind and solar at the level that we know we need, and the level that we know we can can accomplish to cut pollution and push out coal and gas and the other resources we don't want to see in the electricity system. And it's not a given, right? It's not a given that we're going to win all of that money, but that's sort of what the fight is here.
But I will follow up with that, Arjun, just so I make sure that I'm clear and catch this. Yes, we want money for these things that work. But at the same time, in this policy, we have things that we know either don't work, that are harmful, or we know that these things are so far off that they won't work in time for us to really be able to make a difference. Why are we advocating for those things and not just simply saying we don't need those, we don't want those things in, period. Invest in the things that we know work, because we know if we scale those up, we can have the proper solutions or less harmful solutions, while at the same time ensuring that there's some equity as well.
Yeah, and I think we don't see a route in which you pass an electricity standard that explicitly excludes these things that we know won't work. And so then, the question is, do we think that they will work enough that they could grab some money from the federal government and we don't think they will, right? I mean, particularly looking at carbon capture and these new sort of advanced nuclear technologies that are always on the horizon, they're not being built, they're not working, and we don't think they're likely to be built in the next 10 years when we're talking about massively transforming the electricity system, which is, so for us, when we're looking at this, we say, if we can pass something that provides a bunch of money for technologies that can meet this standard, and the only things that will actually be built to meet the standard are wind and solar and energy storage, then we're winning this, we're winning the deployment that we need within the bounds that we have for the technologies that we actually want to see.
With our limited amount of time that we have left, I want to just jump in real quick. We have a number of questions from the audience that kind of revolve around three things that people are hoping to get a kind of a deeper dive in, kind of wanting to know more about nuclear carbon capture and storage and carbon pricing, from the Citizens Climate Lobby perspective, perhaps. And what are concerns regarding these things? What are concerns, particularly from environmental justice communities perspective? Would any of you like to tackle one, two, or three of those things, nuclear, carbon capture, storage, or carbon pricing plans?
I'm happy to start with the carbon capture and storage. And of course, if others have other things to add, feel free to jump in. But I think one of the biggest concerns with carbon capture and storage is that while it sounds like this great idea, it's actually a technology that doesn't exist. And what is actually being classified under carbon capture and storage right now, 80% of it is enhanced oil recovery. So it's, basically capturing carbon, pumping it back into the ground, and then extracting it for the oil and gas industry. So in that sense, it's perpetuating the same cycle of reliance on fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry, when we really need to be diverting that money towards technologies that we know work, like solar and wind, rooftop solar, community solar, that have so many benefits for communities and move us further in the direction of a just and renewable energy future.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I'll tackle the nuclear energy. And so IEN really considers nuclear power a false solution. IEN is, dedicated to uplifting frontline and grassroots fights of Indigenous people all over the world. And we do have, many organizations, especially located in New Mexico, who are fighting against nuclear mining, nuclear expansion, nuclear power in general. And the reason why we believe that nuclear power is not a climate solution is because it's really dirty, it's too dangerous, it's too expensive, and it's too slow. And then at every stage of production, it's actually rooted in environmental injustice and human rights violations. And I will type in the chat one of the organizations to follow to learn more about that fight specifically. But again, I definitely recommend checking out climatefallsolutions.org. It really has all of these different false solutions laid out and explanations for each of them.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I also will note that we had one of your colleagues, Tamara from the Indigenous Environmental Network. She was on our carbon pricing webinar. And of course, you guys have done great work on that. And we'll be sure to share links to your report and the websites for that because we are running low on time here. Michael, as we near our final minutes here, any questions or things you want us to zero in on? And also just know, everybody, we encourage you to stick around after our webinar is done at the top of the hour. You are invited to hang out with us and do some action alerts led by the Reverend Roberta Rominger. And our action alert will be in particular tackling carbon capture and storage, and also lifting up what we do want. And so stick around for that. We'll have an action alert to share on that. But Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I am going to share my screen real quick because I want you all to see. Are you all seeing this, the biomass plant? Do you see this community of trailer homes? And do you see how this biomass plant literally sits in the backyard of these trailer homes? This is why we advocate against false solutions. This is why environmental justice communities are concerned about us, the rhetoric of carbon sequestration, the rhetoric of nuclear, the rhetoric of biomass. It is because there are communities like this community in Gloucester, Mississippi, that suffer under Drax biomass. That when you talk about it lessens pollution, you're still talking about a poisoning of a community. And this community, whether they be poisoned a little bit or a lot, they're still being poisoned. They're just one community, but there are multiple communities out here. I just left another community yesterday in Uniontown, Alabama. I've got another picture of that, but I won't show it to you. This community has a whole mountain of coal ash that was moved from Kentucky because the white folk in Kentucky said that it was harmful. So they moved it to this Black community, this Black rural community of 2,500 people in Uniontown, Alabama, set it in the middle of their community and said that it wasn't harmful anymore. This is what the problem is for us in EJ communities. This is also what the problem should be for us as communities of faith. We are to stand for and be ambassadors for the good of people and planet, not profit. Who cares about working with lawmakers to get something passed just because we can get something passed right now if it continues to do this to people? If it continues to do this to the planet? Who cares about a net zero? That just means you're trading off pollution. We need zero emissions. We need no harm to communities. And we as people of faith, we as communities of faith are the ambassadors for exclaiming this. This is sin. And we ought to stand for righteousness, doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly is our task. And this is what we should be doing. The time has come now, not for us to continue to entertain the conversations or the rhetoric of what can we do. We see what needs to be done. We see what is happening in northern Minnesota. We see that what is continuing to happen in Cancer Alley. I've just shown you a picture of what's going on in Gloucester, Mississippi. I told you about what's happening in Uniontown, Alabama. What's happening in Africatown. Get involved. Exclaim the righteousness. Exclaim the love of people and planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that sermon that needs to be broadcast from every pulpit this Sunday. And thank you for also showing us a visualization of what we're talking about. It's not just an abstract issue. This is a real life people and homes we're talking about. So thank you. We will give a big thanks to our panelists now. We are so grateful that you joined us today to share your wisdom and knowledge. It's been a tremendous webinar that we will share on YouTube and allow other people to get the wisdom moving forward.